I've always believed in fostering a sense of peace within my home. As a yoga instructor, my backyard was my sanctuary, a personal retreat where I could unwind and practice in solitude. Over the years, I had carefully curated the space with potted plants, string lights, and a small koi pond. By March 2023, it felt perfect. Every morning and evening, I'd roll out my yoga mat on the soft grass, surrounded by flowers and the tranquil sounds of nature. It felt like a world of my own, safe, untouched. But all of that changed in a single afternoon. It was a Wednesday, and the weather was ideal. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sunlight was warm, as though spring had arrived early. After a private session with a client in the morning, my schedule was free for the rest of the day. I decided to spend the afternoon tidying up the backyard shed. The small structure sat in the far corner of my garden. It wasn't much, just a place to store tools, gardening supplies, and various odds and ends. Still, each spring, I made it a point to clean it out, organizing shelves and discarding items I no longer needed. At first, everything went smoothly. I turned on some music and began sorting through rusted trowels and rearranging flower pots. About an hour in, I decided to move a heavy box of tools from a lower shelf. As I shifted it, something slipped out from behind and hit the floor. At first glance, I thought it was a battery pack or some kind of gadget, but when I picked it up, my stomach dropped. It was a small black camera. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was holding. It was sleek and modern, resembling one of those mini spy cameras you see in movies. My initial assumption was that it might be some old tech my ex-boyfriend had left behind. He had always been into gadgets. But then I noticed a tiny blinking light. The camera was still on. A strange unease crept over me as I examined it. I hadn't been in the shed for weeks. Who would leave a functioning camera there? I flipped open a small panel on the back and found a memory card. Curiosity outweighed my apprehension, and I hurried back to the house with the camera. Sliding the memory card into my laptop, I opened the folder that appeared. As the first video played, my skin turned clammy. It was me. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. There I was, moving through yoga poses in the center of my backyard. My stomach churned as I clicked through the files. There were dozens of videos, captured at different times of day and in various outfits. Some were from early mornings with the sun rising behind me. Others were at sunset when the yard glowed orange and pink. Then I found a video that made my hands tremble. It showed me sitting on the back porch, legs tucked under me, sipping tea and talking on the phone. It had been recorded just last week. The realization hit me like a wave. Someone had been watching me, not just during my yoga practice, but during quiet, private moments when I thought I was alone. Shutting the laptop, I sat in stunned silence, replaying every memory of time spent outside over the past month. The space I had always considered my refuge now felt violated. The worst part was not knowing who was responsible. After a few minutes, I forced myself to act. Marching back to the shed, I resolved to search every inch of it. My hands trembled as I moved boxes off shelves and checked behind tools. Nothing. I scanned the trellis, the nearby fence line, even the koi pond. Still nothing. Then, something in the back corner of the yard caught my eye. A section of the wooden fence looked slightly out of place. The angle was off, as though someone had tried to pry it loose and then hastily put it back. Crouching down, I shone my flashlight along the gap and saw faint scuff marks in the dirt, as if someone had climbed through. Adrenaline buzzed through me. My backyard wasn't as private as I had believed. Back inside, I paced the living room, trying to decide what to do next. Call the police? But what would I say? Someone had hidden a camera in my shed, but I didn't know when or who. I settled for locking all the doors and windows, pulling the curtains tightly shut, and sleeping with a heavy wrench by my bed. The next morning, I packed up the camera and placed the memory card in a Ziploc bag. Driving to the police station, I felt ridiculous explaining the situation to the officer at the desk, as though I might be overreacting. But the moment she watched the videos, her expression turned serious. She took down my information and assured me they would investigate. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Every noise outside made me jump. I constantly peeked through the blinds and double-checked the locks. I even stopped practicing yoga. My backyard now felt like a stage where I'd unknowingly performed. A few days later, the police called. The officer's voice was calm, but her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "We traced the camera back to your next-door neighbor," she said. "He'd been sneaking into your yard at night to place it there. We found additional footage on his computer." "Additional footage?" I asked, my voice distant and unfamiliar. "Yes," she confirmed. "It appears he's been recording you for months, capturing footage whenever you were outside. We're charging him with stalking, trespassing, and invasion of privacy." I barely remember the rest of the conversation. After hanging up, I sank onto the couch, staring at the wall in silence. My neighbor. The man I'd waved to countless times. The one who smiled at me over the fence while watering his garden. I had never thought twice about him. The police confiscated his equipment, and he moved out a week later. But my sanctuary was gone. Every time I stepped into the yard, I felt exposed and vulnerable. I installed security cameras on every corner of the house and replaced the old wooden fence with a taller, reinforced one. I even adopted a large, loud dog for added security. For months, I couldn't relax out there. Even when friends visited, and we sat on the porch laughing and chatting, I found myself glancing toward the fence, plagued by the feeling that someone might be watching. Now, nearly a year later, the backyard has begun to feel like home again, but it's not the same. I still practice yoga, but only indoors, behind locked doors and drawn blinds. I've come to accept a harsh reality. You can never truly know the people around you. The smiling neighbor, the friendly stranger. Sometimes those you trust the most hide the darkest secrets, and places you believe to be safe can turn out to be anything but. I've always taken pride in being the kind of neighbor who gets along with everyone. You lend someone your lawnmower one day, keep an eye on their house while they're on vacation another. It's the kind of thing that keeps a neighborhood from feeling like just a random cluster of houses. So when the house to my left sat empty for months after my old neighbor moved out, it felt odd, like something had disrupted the usual rhythm of daily life. When a guy named Todd moved in early May of 2021, I was glad to introduce myself. Todd looked to be about my age, mid-30s, maybe a little younger. Right from the start, he struck the perfect balance between chatty and polite. We shook hands, and he mentioned he was between jobs and looking for a fresh start in Raleigh. He made a vague comment about moving down from New York, but I didn't press him. People have all sorts of reasons for moving. I offered to help him unpack a few boxes, but he politely turned me down, saying he had it under control. Over the next few weeks, Todd seemed like a solid guy. He'd wave when I pulled into the driveway, ask how my day had been, and even complimented the work I'd done in my garden. One Saturday morning, while I was cleaning out the garage, Todd wandered over. "Wow, man," he said, looking at my shelves. "You've got every tool anyone could ever need." I laughed, thinking nothing of it. "Hazard of being a homeowner," I said. "You never know what project's coming next." That's when Todd asked if he could borrow a power drill. He mentioned he had some shelves to hang. It didn't seem like a big deal. I'd loaned tools to plenty of people before, so I handed it over. A couple of days later, he returned it with a smile and a thanks. Looking back, it seemed so casual, nothing that would set off any alarms. But about a month later, I started noticing little things. At first it was subtle. A wrench I was sure I'd put back in my toolbox wasn't there when I needed it. A pair of work gloves disappeared from my workbench. I shrugged it off, thinking I'd just misplaced them. My garage wasn't exactly the picture of organization. Then one night, I went to grab a stepladder from the shed out back and noticed the door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd latched it earlier that day. Nothing seemed out of place, but it made me uneasy. I told myself it was probably the wind, or that I'd just forgotten to close it properly. That's when Todd's behavior began to change. He was still friendly, but he started showing up more often. He'd knock on my door just to chat, lingering longer than felt normal. One time, he asked what time I usually left for work in the mornings. "Just curious, man," he said with an easy grin. "Thought I'd ask in case you needed help with that fence you're fixing up. I'm around most mornings." Something about it felt off. Who notices a neighbor's schedule like that? One evening, after I got home from work, I decided to take stock of my garage. I didn't tell anyone. But I'd started feeling paranoid, like I needed to double check that everything was where it should be. I went through the shelves carefully. It wasn't just my imagination. A few things were definitely missing. My ratchet set was gone, along with a flashlight I kept hanging from a hook. I didn't want to believe it was Todd. He'd been so friendly, but the more I thought about it, the more suspicious he seemed. I decided I'd bring it up casually the next time I had the chance, just to see his reaction. That chance came sooner than I expected. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water. My kitchen window overlooks the backyard, and as I stood there, I noticed movement through the trees near the edge of my property. At first I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a stray dog. Then I saw a figure moving toward Todd's house. Whoever it was carried something large and heavy, but in the dim moonlight, I couldn't make out what it was. Squinting, I realized it was Todd. I stood there frozen for a long moment. Why was he sneaking around in the middle of the night, and what was he carrying? The next morning, I decided to confront him. I waited until I saw him sitting on his porch with a coffee mug, acting like everything was normal. I walked over casually, keeping my tone friendly. "Hey Todd, weird question for you," I said. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about some tools going missing, would you? I've noticed a few things out of place in my garage." Todd's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Nah, man, haven't seen anything. I mean, I've got enough on my plate with unpacking." Something about his tone seemed off, too casual, too quick. "You sure?" I asked, watching him closely. "I saw you out pretty late last night. Whatever you were carrying looked pretty heavy." His expression tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just noticed you coming back from somewhere," I said. For a second he didn't say anything, then he forced a smile. "You're mistaken, man. I was home all night." I knew he was lying. That evening I'd had enough. I called the landlord of the house next door, explaining that I was concerned about my new neighbor. What the landlord said floored me. "Neighbor? I haven't rented that house out yet." "What do you mean?" "Someone's living there right now." He introduced himself as Todd. There was a long pause. "Sir, no one is supposed to be in that house. I'll come by tomorrow with the police to check it out." That night I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see Todd staring back at me. By morning, the police and landlord showed up. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. When the officers broke the lock and stepped inside, the truth came out. Todd, or whoever he really was gone. The house was practically empty, except for a pile of stolen items in the basement. My ratchet set, flashlight, and other tools I thought I'd misplaced were there, along with things clearly belonging to other neighbors. A bike, power tools, even a box of jewelry. The police said he'd probably been squatting there for months, using the house as a base to steal from people in the area. They found evidence he'd been sneaking in and out through the back door, crossing my property to avoid the main road. I don't know where Todd went. The police put out a report, but as far as I know, he was never caught. I spent the next week installing new locks on everything. The house, garage, shed, and put up security cameras. I'm still friendly with my neighbors, but I'll never trust someone so easily again. Todd played me perfectly, seeming harmless, even helpful, like the kind of guy you'd have a beer with. But it was all an act. The scariest part, just how convincing he was at it. When I first moved into my Portland apartment, I fell in love with it right away. It was one of those older, charming spaces featuring hardwood floors, crown molding, and vintage wall vents. The kind of place that made you feel like you were living within a piece of history. As a freelance graphic designer working from home, I couldn't wait to settle in, personalize the space, and enjoy the peace and quiet it promised. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I arranged the furniture, decorated the walls, and set up my little corner by the window where the morning light was ideal for sketching. But after a while, I began noticing something unusual. Noises started coming from the vents. At first, it was just soft scratching or the occasional thump. I immediately thought it was something mundane like mice or rats in the ductwork. Older buildings like mine often had pest issues. While not ideal, it wasn't catastrophic. I made a mental note to inform my landlord and tried not to dwell on it. The sounds weren't constant. They would start for a few minutes and then stop, as if whatever was causing them had vanished. Sometimes, while working at my desk, I'd find myself pausing, holding my breath to listen, but then I'd hear nothing. I started convincing myself I was imagining things. Stress from deadlines, perhaps. Maybe I just needed a break. One evening, I was working late on a last-minute design project for a client. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of my laptop fan. Out of nowhere, the noises returned. This time, it wasn't just scratching. There was a distinct shuffle, like something moving. I turned toward the vent on the wall across the room. It was one of those vintage grates with small diamond-shaped openings. Peering at it, I saw only darkness, but the sound was unmistakable. I got up, crouched near the vent, and leaned closer. That's when I swear I heard a faint whisper. Not actual words, but the soft sound of breathing. The moment I leaned in further, the noise stopped. My stomach dropped. Frozen for a second, I quickly pulled back and stood so abruptly I nearly stumbled. No way, I muttered to myself, trying to laugh it off, though my voice was shaky. You're losing it. That night, I went to bed feeling uneasy, convincing myself it was late. I was tired, and old vents made odd noises. Still, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and straining to hear every sound in the apartment. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel safe. The next morning, I called my landlord, explaining that I thought there might be mice or some other pests in the vents. He assured me he'd send someone to check it out later that day. By afternoon, the repairman arrived. He was a gruff, stocky man with a thick gray beard who looked like he'd seen it all. I described what I'd heard. Rats, most likely, he said confidently. They love getting into ducts. Easy access from the crawl space or a neighboring unit. Grabbing his tools, he disappeared into the building's shared attic. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the tension knotting in my stomach. About half an hour later, he returned, looking different. His expression was tight and he avoided meeting my eyes. "Find anything?" I asked, setting my mug down. He hesitated. "Yeah," he said slowly, scratching the back of his head. "Someone's been messing with the vents. Covers are loose, like they've been taken off and put back on. Looks like someone's been crawling through them." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Wait, someone?" He nodded, his face serious. "You should talk to your landlord. This isn't rats." I stood there speechless as he packed up his tools and left. The idea of someone crawling through the vents made my skin crawl. I called my landlord immediately, and he promised to investigate. But that night, the unsettling thought wouldn't leave my mind. Someone squeezing through those dark ducts, moving within the walls of the building. By the next day, I hadn't heard back from the landlord, so I decided to investigate myself. I went to the apartment next to mine, the one adjoining my bedroom wall. It always seemed empty, no lights, no noise, but I'd never paid much attention to it. I knocked on the door. No answer. The door looked dusty, as though it hadn't been used in weeks. Pressing my ear to the wood, I listened for any sign of life, but it was silent. That night, the noises returned. Sitting on my couch, I heard it again. Shuffling, a soft thud, and then breathing. Turning off the TV, I was plunged into an eerie silence. The sound came from the vent near the floor by the couch. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept toward it. Shining the beam into the vent, I saw nothing at first, just dust and the faint outline of the metal tubing. But as I moved the light around, something caught my eye. A glint, like the reflection of an eye. I stumbled back so fast I fell, the flashlight clattering to the floor. My chest heaved as I stared at the vent, the beam still illuminating it. Nothing moved. The eye was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I pushed the couch against the vent and left every light in the apartment on. First thing in the morning, I called the police, explaining that someone was in the vents, crawling through them and watching me. I sounded insane, but I didn't care. When the police arrived, they thoroughly inspected the attic and vent system. They were up there for over an hour before coming back down. One officer asked me to sit. "We found evidence someone's been going in and out of the vents," he said. It looks like they were accessing them from a neighboring unit. I swallowed hard. Which unit? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The apartment next to yours, he confirmed. Your landlord said it's been vacant for months. The police launched an investigation and eventually caught the culprit, my neighbor from across the hall. He'd been sneaking into the vacant apartment, crawling through the vent system, and using it to spy on me. They found small holes drilled into the vent covers, just large enough to see through. He was arrested, but I couldn't stay there. I packed up and moved out as soon as possible. Even now, I can't sit near vents without feeling uneasy. I avoid older buildings altogether. It might sound paranoid, but once you realize someone's been watching you in your most private moments, it changes everything. You never really know who's watching, and sometimes they're closer than you think. I've always relied on Max, my 7-year-old German Shepherd, to be my alarm system, protector, and loyal shadow. As a dog groomer, I often work long hours, but Max is always by my side when I'm at home. We live in a quiet Buffalo neighborhood where snow blankets everything in a soft, muffled silence by mid-December. That silence used to bring me comfort until last winter, when it started to feel wrong. It began as a small, nagging observation. Max had stopped barking. For as long as I'd had him, Max would bark at anything unfamiliar. The mailman, squirrels, even the wind rattling the fence. It was his thing. At night, he'd patrol the yard like clockwork, his deep bark ringing out at the slightest sound. That bark had always made me feel safe, knowing he'd alert me if something was amiss. But last December, the barking stopped. At first, I thought maybe he was just tired. Dogs mellow out as they age, right? I brushed it off for a few nights, busy with the holiday rush at work, grooming what felt like every golden retriever and doodle in Buffalo. I barely had time to think, but every night when I let Max out, I noticed he'd just stand there, staring at the fence instead of running along it like he usually did. He'd sniff the air, his tail low, and then trot back inside without making a sound. I remember joking to myself, "Guess you're retiring early, huh, Max?" But deep down, something didn't feel right. A week passed, and then came the night I decided to check the cameras. I had a basic security setup, 2 motion sensor cameras facing the yard, one near the back porch and another near the fence gate. They'd done their job so far, capturing nothing but raccoons. I wasn't expecting to find anything unusual that night. I just wanted to see if Max had been reacting to something I couldn't hear. It was a little past 11 p.m. when I settled on the couch with my laptop, pulling up the security footage. Max had been acting odd earlier, just staring at the fence again and coming back inside without a bark. The live feed showed nothing unusual, just heavy snow falling, blanketing the yard. I yawned and started scrubbing through the footage from the past few nights. That's when I saw it. On the video from 2 nights before, around midnight, the motion sensor triggered. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out the shape. Then a figure stepped into view. A man. My heart nearly stopped as I watched him move toward the fence, hunched slightly, as if trying to stay low. He paused near the far corner, the spot where Max usually barked the most. Then, to my horror, he crouched down and reached something through the fence. It was hard to see what it was, but Max appeared on screen almost immediately, wagging his tail cautiously as he approached the stranger. The man stayed there for nearly a minute. His hand extended, and Max accepted it. He ate something from the man's hand. "What the hell?" I whispered to no one. The footage ended with the man disappearing back into the dark, leaving behind only a snow-covered yard. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Someone had been in my yard feeding Max. Why? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor being overly friendly? A misguided stranger leaving treats for a great dog? None of it made sense. The next morning, I took Max straight to the vet. I didn't tell the receptionist much, just that he was acting off and I wanted to make sure he was okay. When the vet came back, her expression was concerning. "There's a sedative in his system," she said. "It's mild, but enough to keep him subdued." I felt sick. "What kind of sedative?" I asked. She listed off some options, mostly veterinary-grade tranquilizers used for small surgeries, but I barely heard her. Someone had drugged my dog. My mind flashed back to the man on the footage, crouching by the fence in the dead of night, slipping something to Max while I slept inside, completely unaware. It wasn't random. Someone had done this on purpose. But who? And why? That night I couldn't relax. I kept replaying the video on my laptop, trying to figure out who the man was, what he was holding, and what he wanted. Was he trying to gain Max's trust to get into my yard? My house? The questions looped endlessly in my mind as I sat on the couch, obsessively watching the live camera feed. Around midnight, I got my answer. I turned off all the lights, leaving the room lit only by the glow of my laptop. Max, drug-free for the first time in days, snoozed at my feet. The yard looked empty, just snow falling steadily. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then, the motion sensor went off. My heart skipped as the screen flickered. The same man appeared, his figure hazy in the snowfall. He moved more quickly this time, heading straight for the corner of the fence where Max had met him before. In his hand I could see a small bag, the kind you'd get from a pharmacy. He crouched again, reaching through the fence. This time Max didn't move. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and turned on the porch floodlights remotely. The yard lit up instantly, the snow reflecting the light like a spotlight on the man. He froze, his face now visible in the camera feed. An older man, maybe in his late 60s, with thin, wiry hair poking out from under a hat. Before I could even process it, I yelled through the window, my voice trembling with adrenaline. "Get out of my yard!" The man flinched, looking straight at the camera, straight at me. Something about his expression sent a chill through me. It wasn't anger or guilt. It was almost calm, as if he didn't mind being caught. Then just as quickly, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. I called the police immediately. They arrived about half an hour later, their lights flashing across the snow-covered street. I showed them the footage, my voice shaking as I explained. The officers searched the yard and surrounding area, but the man was long gone. One officer stayed back to talk to me. "You said he fed your dog a sedative?" he asked, watching the video over my shoulder. "The vet confirmed it," I said. "Why would someone do that? Why feed my dog anything?" The officer didn't have an answer. He could only speculate. Maybe he was trying to quiet Max so he could get into the yard. Maybe it was an attempt to break into the house. People do strange things, he said with a sigh. "We'll file a report and keep an eye out. You did the right thing scaring him off." His words were meant to reassure me, but they felt hollow. Keep an eye out? What did that even mean? He couldn't promise the man wouldn't come back, and the image of his calm, unwavering face was still burned into my mind. I forced a thank you, but deep down, I felt utterly alone. I didn't sleep that night. Even after the police left, I stayed up watching the cameras, jumping at every flicker of movement. Max stayed close to me, his ears perked, as if he too was waiting for the man to return. But he never did. Eventually, I found out who the man was. He lived a few doors down, just beyond the property behind mine. I didn't see him leave, but he moved out a couple of weeks after the incident. One morning, I noticed his house was empty, a "for rent" sign back in the yard. The police never got a clear answer on his motives, but they suspected he had been scoping out my property to steal something. Whatever the reason, I'm just glad I caught him when I did. If these neighbor nightmares send a chill down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories to keep you on edge. What would you do if you found out your neighbor wasn't who they seemed? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. Send this video to a friend who swears their neighbors are weird, and remember, safety starts with awareness. Keep your doors locked and your instincts sharp. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.